One of the things that is on an increasing trend is about anxiety, depression, and suicides among the young people are rising globally. I have some really depressing statistics for the next slide, and it really shocked me. And it's a trend that is not sustainable. So we can be talking a lot about technology, education, but if we have young people committing suicide, and I think you just heard there was a massive suicide when the recent results were released, this is not something that we should accept morally. The next is the level of intolerance and extremism. I was really surprised, and this is globally. This is not just something that is happening in India. India is, of course, right there at the top, but it is a global phenomena for both the depression, suicides, as well as this intolerance and violent extremism. I remember coming into Delhi, taking up the position in 2014, and I think in 2015, there was a survey done by actually an NGO from Bangalore on about nearly over 1,000 over young people from India, across young people from ages of 15 to about 25, across different educational fields. And the level of intolerance was surprising and shocking, where more than 60% felt that there was a place for women, there was a place for men. Many of them felt that violence should be used when necessary. Many actually were not too supportive of democracy and wanted autocracy. Many felt that interracial marriages should not be encouraged. It was always all the downward trends. When we're talking about the 21st century, we're supposed to be progressive and liberal. So again, it started people, my colleagues and myself at the Institute to start thinking, because we are with the Mahatma Gandhi Institute, and we were just starting to put in a work program. And we figured that most of the education that was going on in terms of peace education, education for sustainability, education for human rights, were having very limited impact, because many of these have actually gone through an education system. So it was not getting there. It was maybe going in through one and coming out through the other. So there was a problem. So we figured very early on when we were designing our work program that we would not do what most institutes have been doing. And when I tell you a little bit about the program, I hope you find that a little bit innovative with a fundamental philosophical twist. And I think that's a very important twist that you need to take into account as well. And then, of course, we have the global wicked problems. Climate change is here to stay. We still have some people still debating about climate change. It is hopefully a minority, a powerful minority, but still hopefully a minority. Outlier, I hope, as well, with a span of 4 years. Then we have issues of migration, where many people think that migration happens because people wish it. In most cases, they don't. They actually are very comfortable where they are, but they've been forced to migrate through violence, through displacement, through exclusion, and it's an increasing phenomenon. Puts on a lot of social tension across the people, the migrants, as well as the people who are accepting the migrants. And then, of course, the fourth one is the cost of education, which is becoming now a private good. Education has always been considered as a social public good. But I'm not going to talk about the fourth one. That's a whole economic discussion that we should have in a separate presentation, but I want to talk about the first three. 25% of children between the ages of 13 and 15 have some form of depression in India. And 800,000 people between the ages of 15 to 20 are dying by suicide every year globally. This is a global trend. It's not just India, but it's a global trend. And a primary driver, is not the only driver, but a primary direct driver is the education system that we have. I call it the most flawed system that we have. I call it the sector that has not changed over the last 300 years. I always say if you take a teacher 300 years ago and put the teacher right now, except for a few gimmicks here and there, that person will be extremely comfortable. Business is as usual. So this is the current system as we have. It's regimented. That's the system that I went through. The system that my kids have gone through has slightly changed, but still, I would say, regimented to a certain extent. And I say instrumentalists by nature. What do I mean by instrumentalists? Jobs should be an externality. Education should be for human flourishing. It's about providing the competencies that a person is able to lead a life that they have reason to value. The jobs will naturally follow. But if you flip it, and if you say an education system for human capital, and that's what I mean by instrumentalists, is focusing on human capital, the externality of human flourishing is not guaranteed. And in fact, data shows of the depression that is actually negative. Right? How many of us are lucky enough to be in a job where they really have fun and enjoy, and actually it's not a job? We actually go and have fun. I'm one of the few lucky ones who have had that. But many of us, the majority, don't. And we have to have an education system that allows that freedom. So we have listen, don't question, the rote memorization, static, material wealth and prosperity, a key goal. I guess even my kids fall under this. What is your goal? I want to make as much money as possible and retire. I said, retire and do what? But that seems to be like the focus these days. Then the one size fits all. Most of us learn very differently. We are neurobiologically wired differently. And some of us are much better learners through visual. Some of us are very good learners in the rote memorization. That's the 20% who do really well in the present system. Some of us are really good with our hands. So we all learn very differently. And how do we provide a system, an education system that is able to cater to that? And technology offers that. So the standard assessments, that's one thing I want to really focus on. Exams. We really got to get rid of that. Because except for a few people who go into the zone when they go for exams, 90% of us go out of the zone when we go into exams. Kids who know the stuff really well, and once they get into an exams room with this pressure systems, they completely freeze. The whole idea here is to learn. So I really don't like exams. And again, the digital world will offer an alternative to that. So I've already talked about an education for human flourishing, which means it's talk about capabilities. It's about providing the capabilities for each particular individual. The jobs of the future, we have no clue what those jobs are. I never thought that I would be doing what I was going to be doing at this right now. Things have evolved, it's constantly evolving. What we need to provide is equip them with the skills that they can maneuver this ever-changing landscape. That's what the education system has to do. It has to provide the skills where if you go and become a historian and you sort of get excited, but then start thinking about and being introduced to aerospace and says, that really excites me, I want to become a rocket scientist, he can just change because he has those competencies. He has competencies that will not prevent him by getting frightened about mathematics. Because he is driven by the passion of the subject, and therefore the tools, in this case mathematics is not a problem. I just go and learn it. The mindset has to be changed. I don't believe in a kid who cannot do mathematics. I pick mathematics intentionally because most kids have a fear of mathematics. I don't know why. It's one of the most beautiful languages that we have. The kid has to be introduced to it through that lens of beauty. And the education system right now actually intimidates when it comes to mathematics. And art. An education that is not predatorial in nature. The assessments, think about it, people. Assessments is a zero-sum game because you're pitting each other against the other. If you come first, you got to be the second or you got to be third. It's a zero-sum game. And a zero-sum game, mathematicians have proved, is a non-optimal solution. We need to get a cooperative solution. How many of you seen the beautiful mind, Nash, on Nash's life? We need to get a cooperative Nash solution. That's where we need to move towards. And assessments as we have right now don't. It's a zero-sum game. So, and the new approaches has to be based on science and evidence. What I find surprisingly in the education sector is that there is very little science that is being brought into the whole teaching, the whole field of pedagogy. And most educators agree with me on that. And there's a lot of resistance to that as well. When I bring a group of neuroscientists who are working on the science of learning and educators from the traditional education departments, they don't talk to each other. And it's such an exciting thing when you do and watch them interact as an external party, and they are clashing with each other. While the neuroscientists are actually much more forgiving because they want to get into the sector. But the science that's coming out from most of their research, and it's very young research, it's about 20 to 30 years old, is fascinating on how the brain works, on how the brain develops, and how the brain acquires knowledge, and the different types of knowledge, and at which stage. So when do you introduce mathematics? When do you introduce critical thinking? When do you introduce social emotional skills? One of the assumptions that we make is that the brain, the 3-pound mass that we carry between our ears, is only rational. But actually, the research shows that it's a social brain. And there are two dimensions to that, the rational and the emotional. I don't use the word cognitive because everything is cognitive. Even the emotional is cognitive because it is within our brains. And so it's cognition. So I want to make the distinction between rational, which intellectual, and the emotional. And what we have focused primarily over the last 300 years of education has been focusing on the rational, the banking system, knowledge, 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 knowledge. The emotional dimension related with that knowledge has been ignored. The decision is influenced by the emotions as well. We don't realize it. We think it is basically purely on rational, but the emotional plays a major role. And what research says is that we need to train the emotion as we train the rational. So that's the brain, 3 pounds, central command system. Also, the science has shown is that those neural networks are constantly changing. So they call it neuroplasticity. So it's not fixed. As you learn, as you train, new neural networks emerge, all neural networks disappear. It's constantly changing. The highest rate, of course, is during the adolescence to the 25, 26-year-old. That's the highest rates of return. All right? So people like me, the margins are very small. So let's hit them when they are young. And the neuroplasticity, the fact that you create new neural networks offers this huge potential of intervention. But what we have focused, as I said, was completely on the rational. So here we have, what I'm going to show in the next 3 slides very quickly, is the different parts. The first one is the prefrontal cortex, which is where the rational and the intellectual has really been focused. That's the latest development of the human brain. That's the most recent development that sets us apart from other species. This is the thinking. Then, going deep into the inside, the limbic part, these are the attention, regulation, and sensory. This is the emotional brain. Goes in right hand. So we were never able to see that until recent technological improvements where they do functional MRIs, where they can see actually the networks. System that needs to make these connections, a system that creates that neuroplasticity with these new neural networks that are constantly between the rational brain and the emotional brain. And what we call it at the Institute, firing the Gandhi neurons. We picked this up from V.C. Ramachandran, who's a neuroscientist at UC San Diego, and he talked about the whole notion of mirror neurons, empathy neurons, and he called them the Gandhi neurons. But what we think is you need to create that network. And so we call it the firing the Gandhi neurons in a sense that they're not going to be there, they are there, but you need to train them and activate them. So the way that we at the Institute have taken in our work program is that we have stepped away from just talking about Gandhi. We have stopped from sort of just telling about what his thoughts were, what his philosophy was. But what we are trying to do is kind of recreate the kind of neural networks that we think that he had through his whole philosophy of experimentation, philosophy of inquiry, philosophy of empathy, philosophy of compassion. And so that's our program is focused on firing those Gandhi neurons. But we have not forgotten the rational brain as well. And we want to push the critical inquiry part, and rather than the old banking system where we just dump information. We want children to question everything that has been thrown at them. One of the things that I found fascinating when I started going into Hindu philosophy is when I read Swami Vivekananda. How many of you have read some of his work? Fascinating work, philosophically extremely strong, mathematical logic. That's kind of what excited me. But one of the things he said was question, question, question. Never accept even whatever he says as truth. Make sure that you are comfortable. So the whole idea of deconstructing and reconstructing arguments is always essential. That's what we need to teach our kids. How to deconstruct whatever that's been thrown at them, which means parents, buckle up, get ready for a roller coaster ride, because if we have an education system that we are proposing, they're going to challenge you on everything. But it should be fun. This is a socio-emotional learning approach, because that's our mandate. We have not been given a mandate to completely change the education system. We work with partners. But our socio-emotional learning approach, we have two. One is the framework and then the approach. And there I'm moving towards the digital dimensions. So this is the socio-emotional learning approach where we have it on mindfulness. So mindfulness activities here are primarily focused on developing the emotion and the self-regulation. So within yourself, as well as in interacting with the others. So the mindfulness is about the self. Empathy is about with the other. The compassion is to do something about it. Because what scientists have found, and this came from a lab in Germany, when they took a group of people with empathy training, what happens is that if you don't have the compassion training linked with it, you go into empathy distress. And that could be quite dangerous. It leads to depression and suicide. Empathy distress means you feel for the other. And when you talk about empathy, it's not about just listening to the other. It's to put yourself in that person's shoe. So you have to, and it's very difficult. It's extremely difficult. It needs a lot of training to do that. But what you sort of say is you feel and you understand, but you cannot do anything about it. You go into an empathy distress. So the compassion training is sort of trains you to then take action. So that's the action part, the agency part. And that's extremely important. But why did we have critical inquiry? Because we did a thought experiment where you can be mindful, you can be empathetic, you can be compassionate, and yet be a suicide bomber. And so the critical inquiry, the rational part is important as well, because it is a constant dialogue between the emotional and the rational brain. They don't work in isolation. What we have taken for assumption is that the emotional doesn't need training. What we have now learned is that the emotional also has to be trained, as we have been training the frontal neocortex. The approach that we have taken is called the freedom process, and it kind of addresses many of the limitations that we talked about our present system. So it's about storytelling. Believe me, you can actually teach maths with storytelling. And it has relevance. Then you see the beauty of the subject. Narrative-based. So an example was, I came from the old school system, went to the math stream. I was able to do differential calculus with the eyes closed on some of the most complex equations, 6 pages, finding solutions and stuff, but never had a clue what the hell it all stood for. Took a class when I was in graduate school, took a class in aerospace, and then they talked about differential calculus and how they take the rockets to moon and back using differential calculus. It's like, wow. Now you know what the first orders were, what was the second orders were, what was the steady states were, what was the perturbations were, what was the implications of such a thing. And then later on, when you sort of then saw how climate change is explained using those mathematics, again, then you see the relevance. I'm not saying that you have to do that for a grade 1 or a grade 2, but you can have those kind of examples. And as teachers, I'm sure you know that you use some of those. But if you weave in with characters, with a story, with narrative and case studies, it becomes exciting for the kid. Digital pedagogies. We make a point that the digital field should not be just seen as a transmissive platform where you just is used to deliver, but it actually is a pedagogy by itself. It actually is able to create new learning neural networks, and it does. Reflections, part of the empathy training in terms of reflecting on what happened. Games and gamification, a lot of games. Games takes away the need for assessment. Games allows you to be self-paced. So you are within yourself. All right? So imagine you're doing a maths course. The first thing they say is give you a computer, play the game, and if you finish level 6, means you have learned all these outcomes of algebra. And do it at your pace. You fail, it throws you back. Gives you incentives to learn more. So that's the kind of ideology that we are building into most of the stuff that we have been working on for the last few years. Critical inquiry discussion, we also have a lot of, within the particular modules that we develop, we actually allow dialogues across students. So they can create little working groups, and then they can have a dialogue, learn from themselves. Recently, we actually brought in kids and asked them to develop a curriculum around a game. They did a better job than the teachers who we had earlier on to develop a curriculum around the game, because they knew how to maneuver those games and they went in very deep, very quickly. So that's the Libre process. We have developed about 6 modules. We are looking for partners because we can't do this all ourselves. So my 3 cents, unfortunately, there are 4 points. The first one is just a statement. If you don't accept that, you can't accept any of the others. So my whole hypothesis is based on that preposition. Then based on the neurosciences, we need to nurture, so build the emotional intelligence and the resiliency as well as the rational part of it, which we have been focusing on quite a bit. Focus on the whole brain approach. So when you talk about 21st century, look at what the 21st century skills are. But to achieve those 21st century skills, you need these fundamental competencies. If you want collaboration, you need empathy and compassion. Otherwise, you do collaboration for the sake of for an outcome. So I collaborate with you only because I'm going to get something out of it. What we want to change the mindset is I want to collaborate with you because together we can do something good. So it moves from the instrumentalist to the flourishing dimension. Scale and achieve individualized learning while making learning fun. It has to be fun. I don't know why it seems to be oxymoronic when talk say you can't make learning fun. It has to be difficult. I don't know why that mindset has. I don't know when that emerged. But if you make it fun, it stays there. And then you can explore potentials. Predators to nurturers. So I am a really well-trained predator because I came from a system that really trained us well. And it's now been spending a lot of time trying to move away from that. And my staff have a great time because my first immediate reaction is one of a predator and say, Anantha, you're in the Gandhi Institute. You can't do that. You know, the first thing is to go out and take the other guy out. I see a competition, let's take him out. I said, hang on, we're the Gandhi Institute, we're supposed to work with them. I said, yeah. So it takes a lot of training. The emotional part has been so well established that it takes a lot of continuous daily training and reflection. So that's why we want to move the education from predators to nurturers. Thank you very much.